Dr. Perez, one of the first questions was from your presentation. It said, if we want to compare regions' participation rate, how should we define participation?
Well, the way we did it was based on the probability of reporting, given that so actually the first one was enrollment in comparison to the population of farmers in the region. So it's a probability of being enrolled. But then the second way was probability of reporting, given that you have enrolled, which is something that we didn't used to think about. I mean, we used to think that being enrolled, then people would be participating, but actually that was not the case. So I would say that the definition based on these results would be the probability of sharing data as previously specified and at a given period of time that was previously specified by the agreement.
Thank you. Dr. Murtaugh, do you think Ben House's proposition that metagenomic sequencing will improve phylogenetics of viruses, and could it have a significant impact on the information that you presented?
Metagenomics is a tremendously powerful tool of data generation. The way in which the data is generated affects how much value it has. What I think will be particularly useful is starting to understand populations of organisms and how they contribute to health and disease. It's not just one pathogen in a vacuum or one agent in a vacuum. It's the entire population where you will have interactions between bacteria, viruses, fungi, and the host, some of which will be beneficial and some of which will not.
Okay. Dr. Hollis, were there any adjustments made between the first and the last herd that broke with PRRS 174? And I guess a second kind of follow-up was, what, if any, changes would you make now after going through that experience?
Yeah, there were changes with every one of them, so they're not apples and apples. The first one, we used live virus inoculation with modified live vaccine. That was bad, so we didn't do that in the following 2 through 5. The second and third, we did go in and wean down prior to having quality pigs, and that was an effort to clean up. The fourth and fifth, we waited until we had already started to arrive at quality pigs. So, but in every case there were differences, and there's differences in the layout of the buildings and differences in the number of gilts that can come in based on space. But some of the absolutes would be a known naive gilt with modified live vaccine going into that population, and an absolute of no pig movement, period, and then an absolute of when quality pigs came into farrowing, begin planning for that farrowing house cleanup or wean down.
We'll just stay with you with this next question. Kind of interesting. It says, if you have a litter of 20 or more, do you euthanize to teat count or just leave them alone? So in other words, I added this. Do you ever bend the rules?
You don't bend the rules on movement of pigs. You do euthanize pigs that are unable to compete. And I also would say some of our staff, including the vets, me, are not very good at guessing teat count. So a sow that you thought was going to lactate 14 may actually lactate 15 or 16. What you have to do is watch the sow, because the sow is going to do everything possible to milk pigs, and she may give up all of her body mass to lactate pigs. So you have to be very cautious about lactating 16 big pigs on a sow, but you can't euthanize poor quality pigs.
Dr. Bautista.
Yes.
We're using a nurse sow instead of moving the pigs because we should follow the MacRevel rules. But If not, you will see your mortality increase if you don't use a nurse cell. So you don't even use nurse cells in these situations?
The question was, would you use a nurse sow, and couldn't you use a nurse sow for part of that litter? I find that we all use terms like McRebel and nurse sow as if they mean the same thing, but they don't always mean the same thing to each person. So for me, in farrowing, yes, if I have a sow that has 20 pigs, and I believe there's 20 viable pigs, and I have a late lactation sow that I can move into an empty stall in that room that is already lactated, I may use her, but that's a risk and a very uncommon decision. Number one, because you want all the colostrum possible, and the only way they're going to get colostrum is off their own mother, because I'm not going to move them around. So I'm going to leave them on their own mother for colostrum, and I do know that there are situations where, let me give you two situations, where a sow is failing. She has a beautiful litter of 10, 12, 14 pigs, and she's failing. She goes out, and she's replaced with what you're describing as a nurse sow. The other would be a litter of 2 or 3 that are euthanized. So that sow that had 2 or 3 pigs, her litter is euthanized. She becomes a donor for the other half of the litter of 20. What I don't like is giving a group of 3 or 6 or 8 farm staff on a farm the license to create nurse sows and do modified McRebel when we really haven't defined what that means.
Quick follow-up.
No, I understand what you mean, and I'm as strict as you are. But when you have, like, I have a client with 10,000 sow farm, so you have a lot of farrowings, and you have to do things like this because you have several litters of 20. So I just do what you were doing, but what we do is split suckling at first for the first 2 days. So we just put half of the litter in a crate, and then we move them back again, and then I use the nurse sow. So I'm not bending the rules at all, but we are saving the pigs. Mm-hmm. That's what we're doing.
Very good. Yeah, I agree.
This is a question for Dr. Murtaugh. So, Dr. Murtaugh, you referenced size of population impacting the evolution of the PRRS virus. Is there a threshold size of population in which the probability of virus change increases?
No. What's the biggest litter of pigs that you've ever experienced? I didn't know sows could have 20.
Every week. I heard that every week.
That's pigs per sow per year, not pigs per litter.
That's one litter. That's one litter. Yeah.
How?
Yeah.
Jesus.
So
genetics, it's a miracle.
Yeah, there's sows that have 20 pigs.
It's another question for Dr. Perez. What impact, if any, does size of farm have on the incidence of PRRS outbreak in a sow farm, in a sow herd? Has this been studied, and if so, what size is more at risk?
Well, what has been found was, in general, that large farms tend to be more likely to have outbreaks. That's probably also true for every single infectious disease, simply because you have more animals, more contacts, more movements, more exposure. But then precisely for those reasons, we shouldn't forget that it's more difficult to measure and in small farms and small size where the disease may be sitting, really. So the fact that we found that doesn't really imply that we should only care about that.
Okay. This is a question for everyone. It says, how do you define new versus old PRRS virus? Or another way, when a sow farm undergoes a break, how do you define if it was a new unrelated PRRS versus a rebreak with the same old virus?
Was that Dr. Lauer?
You sequence the viruses, meaning OR5. And then you have an argument about what percent identity makes it the same or different.
Right. Sometimes it's easy, right?
So AASV, I think it was, with Paul Yeski and Bob Morrison and some others, had a put a committee together to decide what the break point was in percent similarity where you could say this is different or this is the same. The first thing that Bob Morrison did was make everybody write down their opinion on a piece of paper. And the range was from, I think, 1% to 7%. Well, obviously, everyone who said something different from 2 or 3 was wrong. But it was an eye-opening experience. But viruses change over time. So the longer you wait, the more difference you'll have. So you can't just make an arbitrary point because there's so many factors which affect what it is. I think that, so the average between 1 and 7 is about 4 or 3 or 2. But
I think Dale Polson calls that a Monte Carlo exercise.
If I can add, Mike, I think that the problem is when the virus, the two viruses that you are trying to compare are within that threshold. So if you're above, name it, 4%, 3, 5, whatever, something, then you are relatively certain that those are different. But the problem is that sometimes you have viruses within 2%, 3, 4%, and that you cannot really tell that those are the same. Those might be different. So I think that as we increase, that paper that Mike mentioned actually looked at that as one of the factors, but then there were factors that were considering, like if there were introductions into a farm or not, a given number of epidemiological factors that may help to make that call. I think that as we increase collecting information and combining these information, we may come up with some systems that dynamically, and given the conditions in the setting, as Mike was saying, time, number of outbreaks, incidents, all those things matter. So if we could put everything together, then hopefully we can improve our ability to give an answer.
What I'd like to add to that would be, actually, Dr. Lauer was poking me after I was done with that type of question, because we have 174s, again, just the RFLP cut pattern, but we have viruses within a few percentage in sequence that either rebound or come back even in the same herd. And then we have similar viruses, very similar in sequence, show up in herds with very different clinical impression. Very different clinical.
This is kind of a pathogenesis question, but it's how easily does 174 cross the placenta, and how early in an outbreak will fetuses be positive by PCR? Who would like to take a stab at that
PCR one? Positives show up at day 46.32.
That's as close as I would ask for.
Is that in minutes or days?
The comment was that minutes or days?
So it's variable like all the other strains, I would assume.
I'm not aware that K. Fabric has thought about virus crossing the placenta as much as anyone. No, I'm not aware that 174 isolates have been taken into the lab and studied yet. And if they have, it's fairly new information.
I just wanted to add that viruses can cross the placenta, but I don't know of anybody who's done any studies on the percentage of PCR positives at different times, unless maybe Bob Rowland.
Well, the Hansu Jude at Minnesota in about 1991 did a study where he looked at infecting in the 1 to 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days. And this would have been with VR2332 or some other early virus before highly pathogenic viruses appeared. And there were no disease symptoms, no reproductive disease at 30 days of infection or at 60. At 90 days, late gestation, the abortions and weak-born pigs were observed. PCR didn't exist at the time. Few, if any, labs had figured out how to isolate and grow the virus. So questions about when the virus crossed the placenta or anything like that is unanswerable from that kind of study. And I'm not aware that anyone is looking at that. Oh, I take that back. John Harding at SASC, he's done a huge amount of reproductive studies recently.
So with the Genome Canada work that John Harding did and Andrea Ladning, they showed that once the virus gets into the arm, it gets into one pig, that pig then can transfer the virus to its neighbors. So that's a really important thing, and that's using 86 days when the pigs are infected. They went for a 21-day infection time to show that. Now the newest things they're doing is earlier time after the sow is infected and looking at how it's transferred from the mother to the fetus and between fetuses.
Very good. I think due to time, I'd like everyone to give the presenters another round of applause. Thank you.